The first human ship arrived without herald or permission, a narrow spindle of layered metal drifting into the outer light of Karath's blue star like a thought that had taken too long to form. It did not announce itself with the ritual pulses customary among the starfaring polities of the region. It did not adjust its vector to match the traffic spirals. It simply arrived, engines cooling, hull scarred by old impacts that had been repaired not for beauty, but for endurance. The Watchers of Karath, whose profession was to notice such things before they became problems, argued among themselves for several long hours about whether the vessel was derelict, mad, or performing some new and discourteous strategy. None of them guessed that it was tired. Inside the ship, Mara Ionescu counted breaths while the gravity plates hummed beneath her boots. She had been counting for most of the last week, ever since the engines had fallen quiet, and the long deceleration had given her time to feel the accumulated weight of every decision that had brought her here. She had not been trained for first contact, not in the ceremonial sense. She was a systems engineer by trade, a coordinator by necessity, and a human by stubborn accident of birth. The role of envoy had been pressed upon her by the simple logic that she was the last senior crew member still capable of standing for more than an hour at a time. The ship itself, named Perseverance not as a boast, but as a reminder, had once been part of a convoy meant to test the long corridor between Sol's scattered descendants and the wider galaxy. The corridor had not been empty. It had been contested, patrolled by powers older and more assured of their place among the stars. The convoy had not survived. Perseverance had limped away, carrying refugees and records and the sum total of human hopes compressed into redundant drives and frightened minds. By the time the ship crossed into the influence of Karath, there were fewer than 1,000 souls awake aboard, and many of those were awake only because sleep had become impossible. Mara stood in the narrow chamber designated as the reception room, though it had been designed more as a conference nook for internal disputes than as a place to greet aliens. The walls bore the faint scratches of tools and hands, marks left by people who had worked while braced against acceleration. She had insisted that the room remain as it was, without decorative panels or borrowed symbols. If this was to be the first impression humanity made upon a new civilization, she wanted it honest. There would be no grand banners, no martial displays, no carefully curated myths. There would be a woman in worn clothing, a table scarred by use, and a willingness to speak plainly. When the Karathian delegation arrived, they did so with an elegance that made the human engineers watching through the internal cameras shift uncomfortably. The docking maneuver was flawless, the pressure equalization precise to a degree that suggested either great care or utter indifference to the risk of failure. The airlock opened, and the first of the aliens stepped through. They were taller than humans, their bodies composed of interlocking plates that shifted subtly as they moved. Their limbs were arranged in a symmetry that suggested both balance and strength, and their faces, if such a word applied, bore clusters of sensory organs that glittered faintly in the artificial light. They carried no visible weapons, though the absence itself felt deliberate. The lead figure inclined its upper body, a gesture that Mara's translators interpreted as a formal acknowledgement rather than a bow. "I am Kithra of the Talan Reach," the alien said, its voice resonant and carefully modulated. "We observe your presence within our monitored space. You have not followed established protocols. Explain." Mara resisted the urge to apologize. Humans had done enough of that lately, often to beings who took apologies as admissions of weakness rather than gestures of goodwill. Instead, she placed her hands flat on the table, fingers spread, a posture she had learned conveyed openness without submission among many cultures. "My name is Mara Ionescu," she said. "I speak for the people aboard this vessel. We did not know your protocols. We did not know your space was monitored. We are here because we are running out of places to go." The Karathians exchanged subtle shifts of posture that Mara's limited cultural briefing could not decode. Kithra's sensory clusters dimmed slightly, then brightened again. Running implies pursuit, Kithra said. Our records do not indicate hostilities involving your species within this region. Our records are incomplete, Mara replied. We have lost ships and worlds beyond your charts. We are not at war in the way you define it. We are being erased in the way that does not make the news until it is over. There was a long pause. Mara let it stretch. She had learned that silence, when used deliberately, could be as powerful as any argument, though she was careful not to treat it as a weapon. Finally, Kithra gestured, and another member of the delegation extended a device that projected a lattice of light into the air between them. The lattice resolved into star maps, trade routes, and spheres of influence marked with symbols that meant little to Mara, but clearly mattered a great deal to the Carethians. You occupy a corridor claimed by the Veskari coalition, Kithra said. They are persistent. They do not relinquish claims lightly. If you are trespassers, their response would be thorough. They were, Mara said simply. They did. The words landed like a dropped tool. The Carethians were not accustomed to such bluntness in diplomatic exchanges. They were a people who valued context, who wrapped truths in layers of implication. Mara had no time for that. She could feel the ship around her, the hum of systems straining to keep everyone alive, the quiet desperation of a population that had already lost too much to accept another polite deferral. Kithra studied her, or at least oriented its sensory clusters in a way that suggested focused attention. If what you say is accurate, Kithra said, then your presence here introduces risk. The Veskari coalition will not ignore a new settlement, nor will they tolerate interference. Why should we involve ourselves? Mara smiled then, a small and tired expression that held no triumph. Because if you do not, you will eventually face the same question from someone else. We are not asking you to fight for us. We are asking you to let us exist, to trade, to learn, to contribute. We are very good at contributing. One of the other Carethians emitted a low vibration that the translator flagged as skepticism. Your vessel is damaged, it said. Your numbers are small. Your technology is uneven. What value do you offer that would justify the attention of those who already contest this space? Mara considered listing achievements, the centuries of human innovation, the adaptability that had carried them from a single world to the stars. She considered speaking of art and philosophy and the stubborn refusal to surrender that had become a cultural trait. Instead, she gestured to the walls, to the scars and the patched conduits visible through transparent panels. We offer work, she said. We offer hands that do not give up when the tools break. We offer minds that find ways forward when the maps end. We have been building in the dark for a long time. We have learned how to do it without asking permission. The Carethians retreated to confer among themselves, their conversation a complex interplay of vibrations and light that the human translators could not follow. Mara leaned back slightly, feeling the ache in her spine. She wondered if she had been too blunt, if her refusal to play the expected games would cost them their last chance. She thought of the children aboard Perseverance, of the elders who had volunteered to sleep longer so that resources could be conserved, of the engineers who worked double shifts without complaint because there was no alternative. When the Carethians returned their attention to her, Kithra spoke with a tone that suggested a decision had been reached, though perhaps not a unanimous one. Your request is irregular, Kithra said. Granting you space within our influence would provoke response. However, refusing you may provoke other responses, less predictable. We will permit you to remain temporarily while we assess the broader implications. You will share your records of engagement with the Veskari coalition. You will submit to observation. Any expansion beyond your current vessel will require negotiation. Mara released a breath she had not realized she was holding. That is more than we hoped for, she said. Thank you. Do not mistake this for alliance, Kithra cautioned. We are not your protectors. Mara nodded. We have never had protectors, she said. Only neighbors, sometimes enemies. We will do our best to be the former. The first days within Carethian space were a study in contrasts. The Carethians were methodical, their infrastructure vast and meticulously maintained. Their stations gleamed, their ships moved with choreographed precision, and their communications were layered with redundancies that spoke of a culture deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. The humans, by contrast, were improvisational. They adapted to Carethian systems with a mix of curiosity and irreverence, finding shortcuts and workarounds that made their hosts uneasy. Where Carethian engineers followed protocols that had been refined over generations, human engineers asked why those protocols existed and whether they could be bent without breaking. Mara found herself acting as a bridge not just between species, but between philosophies. She spent long hours in discussion chambers, explaining human decisions that seemed reckless to the Carethians and Carethian caution that seemed paralyzing to humans. She learned that the Carethians had not always been so careful. Their history included eras of rapid expansion and costly mistakes, times when ambition had outpaced wisdom. The structures of restraint that now defined them were the result of hard lessons learned and codified. Humanity, she realized, was in the midst of learning those lessons at a speed that left little room for codification. They were a species still defining itself, still deciding which traits to elevate and which to leave behind. The losses inflicted by the Veskari coalition had stripped away many illusions. What remained was a core of resilience that surprised even the humans themselves. The first true test of their presence came sooner than anyone expected. Carethian sensors detected a Veskari probe entering the outer reaches of the system, its signature unmistakable. The Carethians convened emergency councils, their leaders debating responses that balanced deterrence with deniability. The humans watched from the margins, acutely aware that they were the reason for this tension. Some among them argued that they should leave, slip away before their hosts paid a price for their hospitality. Others argued that running again would only confirm every negative assumption others held about them. Mara listened to these debates and felt the familiar weight settle on her shoulders. She requested permission to address the Carethian Council directly, a move that caused no small amount of consternation. Humans were guests, not stakeholders. Their voice carried no formal authority. Granting them a platform in such a moment was unprecedented. It was granted anyway, in part because Kithra argued that understanding the human's perspective might reveal options the Carethians had not considered. Standing before the council, Mara did not offer strategy or demand protection. She spoke instead of patterns. She described the Veskari approach as humans had experienced it, the probing incursions followed by overwhelming force, the offers of absorption framed as mercy. She explained how humans had survived by dispersing, by making themselves costly to eradicate without ever matching their enemies in raw power. She spoke of alliances formed not through treaties, but through shared projects, of earning goodwill by solving problems that others had deemed intractable. "You are thinking in terms of borders and claims," Mara said. "They are thinking in terms of inevitability. They assume that time favors them. We have learned that time favors those who refuse to behave as expected." The council listened. Some were intrigued, others skeptical. But when the Veskari probe advanced deeper, ignoring Carethian warnings, a decision was made that bore the subtle imprint of human influence. Rather than confront the probe directly, the Carethians allowed it to approach a region of space dense, with debris and fluctuating gravitational fields, a place they had long avoided due to the difficulty of navigation. Human pilots volunteered to guide Carethian ships through the maze, their experience with damaged systems and unpredictable environments suddenly invaluable. The resulting encounter did not end in battle. The Veskari probe, confronted with a coordinated presence in a space it had deemed impractical to contest, withdrew to reassess. It was a small victory, perhaps temporary, but it demonstrated something that could not be unlearned. Humanity, even in its diminished state, altered the calculus of those around it. They brought uncertainty, creativity, and a refusal to accept the narratives imposed upon them. As the days turned into weeks, and the provisional became habitual, the Carethians began to see the humans not as a problem to be managed, but as a force that changed the texture of their society. Human technicians collaborated with Carethian counterparts, questioning assumptions and proposing hybrid solutions. Human educators shared methods for teaching under resource constraints, methods born of necessity rather than theory. Human children played in Carethian habitats, adapting to alien gravity with laughter and scraped knees. Mara watched these developments with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She knew that acceptance was fragile, that one misstep could undo months of careful integration. She also knew that humanity had never thrived by treading lightly. Their strength lay not in their ability to blend in, but in their capacity to reshape environments through persistence and empathy. Late one cycle, as she gazed out at the blue star that anchored the system, Kithra joined her. The alien's presence had become familiar enough that Mara did not startle. "You are changing us," Kithra said, not accusingly but with a tone of careful observation. Mara nodded. "We tend to do that," she said. "Sometimes we change ourselves in the process." Kithra considered this. "We will be watched more closely now," it said, "by the Veskari coalition and by others. Your survival may invite conflict." Mara met its gaze. "Our survival always has," she said. "But we are still here." The star flared slightly as a distant storm rippled across its surface, a reminder of the vast forces at play beyond any single species' control. Mara felt small in that moment, and yet unbroken. Humanity had arrived in Carethian space, not as conquerors or supplicants, but as participants in a larger story still being written. Whatever chapters lay ahead, she knew one thing with certainty. They would be written by hands that refused to let go. The provisional period granted by the Carethians had a way of stretching itself, days folding into one another as necessity rewrote expectation. What had been described as temporary tolerance became, through repetition and shared labor, a form of quiet coexistence. Human habitats were attached to the outer lattice of a Carethian station, not because it was symbolically welcoming, but because it was structurally convenient. The Carethians had calculated stress tolerances and thermal gradients. The humans had looked at the same data and suggested where people could live without freezing or cooking themselves. The resulting arrangement was inelegant by Carethian aesthetic standards and profoundly comforting by human ones. It felt like home not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. Mara spent less time in formal councils and more time walking corridors where translators lagged behind lived experience. She listened to complaints from human technicians frustrated by Carethian insistence on triple verification before any system modification. She listened to Carethian overseers unsettled by human willingness to bypass safeguards in order to restore function under pressure. Each conversation required a careful balance between defense and admission. She learned to say, "We do this because we had to," without implying that it was therefore the best way. She learned to say, "You do this because it has kept you safe," without suggesting that safety was an end in itself. The Carethians were not unkind, but kindness to them was a structured concept, embedded in policy and precedent. Humans introduced something messier, spontaneous assistance, the habit of noticing a problem and addressing it without waiting for authorization. At first, this behavior was tolerated as a cultural quirk. Then it became relied upon. A Carethian agricultural ring suffered a failure in its nutrient cycling system, a problem that had stymied their specialists because the fault did not conform to known patterns. A human maintenance crew, invited more out of politeness than expectation, traced the issue to a feedback loop created by a rare microbial interaction. They did not have a textbook solution. They improvised one, introducing a controlled disruption that reset the cycle. The ring recovered. The Carethians logged the solution with a notation that translated roughly to effective but inelegant. That notation appeared again and again in shared records. The Veskari probe's withdrawal did not go unnoticed beyond Carethian space. Long-range sensors picked up increased traffic along neighboring corridors, ships altering course in subtle ways that suggested interest rather than intent. The Carethians responded by reinforcing patrols and revisiting contingency plans that had not been updated in generations. Humans responded by asking where help would be most useful if things went wrong. The difference in approach was not lost on either side. Mara convened a human assembly, not a formal council, but a gathering in a converted cargo bay where people could speak freely. She stood among them rather than above them, her presence a reminder that leadership among humans was a function, not a status. Faces looked back at her, some lined with exhaustion, others bright with a cautious hope that had no precedent in their recent history. "We are being watched," she said, "not just by the Carethians, by others who will decide what we are based on what we do here. We can choose to be careful guests, minimizing our footprint and waiting for permission. Or we can choose to be useful neighbors, accepting that usefulness sometimes draws attention." A murmur ran through the crowd, not dissent but recognition. These were people who had rebuilt ships from debris fields, who had turned derelicts into sanctuaries and scarcity into a kind of discipline. Waiting had never been their strength. An older woman named Anya Petrescu, whose hands bore the scars of a lifetime of mechanical work, spoke up. "We did not survive by hiding," she said, "but we also did not survive by picking fights we could not finish. Usefulness is a middle path. Let us walk it with our eyes open." That sentiment became something like a motto, though humans rarely codified such things formally. They walked the middle path by volunteering for projects others avoided, by taking on maintenance tasks deemed too labor-intensive for automation, by sharing data without demanding immediate reciprocity. They were careful not to present themselves as indispensable, but they made absence noticeable. The Carethians, for their part, began to adjust their models. They had long believed that stability was achieved through predictability, that minimizing variance was the surest way to maintain equilibrium. Humans introduced variance as a feature rather than a bug. Their presence created fluctuations that initially alarmed Carethian analysts, but over time, those fluctuations proved to absorb shocks that would otherwise have propagated through the system. A trade route disrupted by a minor incident was rerouted through a human-managed logistics hub that adapted in hours rather than days. A political dispute between two Carethian subpolities was defused when human mediators reframed the issue not as a zero-sum allocation, but as a shared maintenance problem. None of this went unnoticed by the Veskari coalition. The first direct message arrived encoded in a format that predated human presence in the region, a deliberate choice that signaled both authority and disregard. It was addressed to the Carethian leadership, but copies were routed through channels that ensured human observers would see it. The content was brief and chillingly polite. The Veskari coalition acknowledged increased activity within Carethian space, noted deviations from established patterns, and expressed concern that unauthorized entities were influencing regional stability. They requested clarification and hinted at corrective measures should clarity not be forthcoming. The Carethian Council convened in emergency session. The chamber was a vast amphitheater of light and geometry designed to facilitate consensus among beings whose sensory perceptions varied widely. Humans were present only as observers, their seating arranged along the periphery. Mara felt the weight of that placement, the implicit reminder that while humans mattered, they did not yet belong. The debate was intense, but measured. Some council members argued for distancing themselves from humanity, framing it as a necessary sacrifice to preserve long-term security. Others argued that capitulation would only embolden the Veskari coalition, inviting further interference. Kithra spoke less than usual, listening with an attentiveness that suggested the situation had outgrown familiar categories. When the time came for a decision, the council reached for a compromise that satisfied no one entirely. They would respond to the Veskari message with a reaffirmation of sovereignty, asserting their right to engage with non-hostile entities within their space. They would avoid explicit mention of humanity's role, neither highlighting nor denying it. It was a cautious move designed to buy time. Time, however, was precisely what the Veskari coalition had learned to compress. Within days, Veskari vessels appeared at the edges of Carethian sensor range, their formations calculated to test response times without crossing lines that would justify immediate retaliation. The Carethians mobilized defenses, their ships moving into positions that had not been occupied in living memory. Humans watched, their own vessels small and battered by comparison, keenly aware that they could not match such displays of force. Mara requested a private audience with Kithra. The meeting took place in a narrow observation gallery overlooking the station's exterior, where human habitats clung like barnacles to the grand curves of Carethian architecture. The juxtaposition felt symbolic in ways Mara did not entirely like. "They are escalating," Mara said, stating the obvious, because sometimes obvious truths needed to be spoken aloud. "And they are doing it because of us." Kithra's sensory clusters shifted, patterns of light reflecting internal calculations. "They are escalating because they perceive uncertainty," it said. "You are a variable they cannot yet quantify." Mara leaned against the railing, feeling the faint vibration of the station's systems through her bones. "We do not want to be a liability," she said. "If our presence puts you at risk, we will leave." Kithra turned fully toward her, a gesture that carried weight in Carethian body language. "You misunderstand," it said. "Risk is not inherently negative. Stagnation is. The Veskari coalition thrives on predictable fear. They press until resistance collapses or conforms. You do not conform." "That has been a problem for us before," Mara said, a wry edge creeping into her voice. "And a solution," Kithra replied. "The council is divided, but there is growing recognition that yielding now would define us more narrowly than we wish. However, recognition does not equal readiness. If conflict comes, we must decide how far we are willing to go." Mara nodded slowly. "Humans are not in a position to fight a conventional war," she said, "but we have experience with asymmetry, with making occupation expensive without meeting force head-on. We could share that experience." Kithra considered this. "Sharing experience is different from sharing command," it said. "There is concern that your methods lack restraint." Mara met its gaze. "Our methods are restrained by necessity," she said. "We do not have the luxury of excess. Every action costs us something. That makes us careful in ways you might not recognize." The conversation ended without resolution, but something shifted in its wake. Human analysts were quietly invited to Carethian planning sessions, their role framed as advisory rather than directive. They brought with them a perspective shaped by loss and adaptation, one that valued resilience over dominance. They suggested strategies that focused on infrastructure resilience, on decentralizing critical systems so that no single strike could cripple the whole. They advocated for transparency with civilian populations, arguing that informed communities responded better under stress than sheltered ones. Some Carethians bristled at these suggestions, seeing them as admissions of vulnerability. Others recognized in them a pragmatic wisdom born of hard experience. Implementation was uneven, but it began. The Veskari coalition responded to the Carethian message with a show of patience that was more threatening than immediate aggression. Their ships maintained positions just beyond engagement range, their communications filled with offers of assistance framed as concern. They proposed joint patrols to ensure regional stability, a euphemism that carried a familiar weight. They invited Carethian observers aboard their vessels, gestures of openness that masked an attempt to normalize presence. The Carethians declined politely. The humans watched closely. It was during this tense standoff that a crisis emerged from an unexpected quarter. A Carethian mining installation on the system's outer rim suffered a catastrophic failure when a microfracture in its containment field cascaded, threatening to release volatile material into surrounding space. The installation's automated systems initiated shutdown protocols, but the process was slow, optimized for safety under normal conditions rather than emergency response. Evacuation would take hours the installation did not have. Human sensors detected the anomaly before Carethian systems flagged it as critical, a consequence of humans' tendency to monitor for irregularities rather than thresholds. Mara received the alert and did not hesitate. She authorized a human response team to deploy, even as Carethian authorities scrambled to coordinate their own. The decision was risky, bordering on insubordinate, but delay would cost lives. The human team arrived at the installation in a patched shuttle that rattled under stress, its pilots adjusting thrust manually to compensate for interference. They did not wait for full synchronization with Carethian command. They moved through the installation's corridors, bypassing locked sections with tools that had been improvised from spare parts. They found the fracture, a shimmering instability that threatened to tear containment apart. A Carethian engineer on site protested the human approach, warning that direct intervention could worsen the cascade. The human team leader, a man named Pavel Markovic, whose background was in disaster response on collapsing orbital habitats, listened and then acted anyway. He introduced a counter-vibration into the containment field, not to stabilize it fully, but to slow the cascade enough for evacuation to complete. The maneuver violated multiple Carethian safety protocols. It also worked. The installation was lost, its structure too compromised to salvage, but its personnel survived. News of the incident spread quickly, accompanied by data logs that left little room for reinterpretation. Humans had acted decisively without waiting for permission and had saved lives at the cost of material assets. The Carethian response was conflicted. Officially, the action was noted as unauthorized. Privately, gratitude was expressed. The families of those saved made their feelings known, their relief cutting through bureaucratic caution. The council reviewed the incident in exhaustive detail, debating whether it represented a dangerous precedent or a necessary evolution. The Veskari coalition took notice as well. Their observers, positioned to monitor Carethian response times, recorded the human intervention. To them, it was evidence not of heroism, but of unpredictability. Unpredictability, when paired with effectiveness, was unsettling. Mara was summoned before the council to account for her decision. She did not apologize. She explained the reasoning, the calculations made under pressure, the acceptance of loss as the price of survival. She spoke of the difference between preserving systems and preserving people, a distinction humans had been forced to confront repeatedly. "We do not take such decisions lightly," she said. "But we have learned that waiting for certainty can be more dangerous than acting with incomplete information. We acted to save lives. If that is unacceptable, say so now." The council did not say so. They issued a formal reprimand, carefully worded to acknowledge the violation without condemning the outcome. It was a compromise that reflected their own internal struggle. In the aftermath, something intangible shifted. Carethian engineers began to consult human counterparts earlier in crisis scenarios, not as last resorts, but as parallel resources. Humans, for their part, made greater efforts to understand Carethian protocols, seeking ways to integrate their rapid response ethos without undermining established safeguards. The middle path narrowed, but it remained walkable. The Veskari coalition escalated again, this time through economics rather than force. Trade partners within Carethian space received offers that undercut existing agreements, incentives designed to create dependency. The Carethians faced pressure from within as well as without, voices arguing that cooperation with humanity was costing them stability and prosperity. Humans responded by sharing what little economic leverage they had, opening their data archives, offering access to manufacturing techniques optimized for resource scarcity. These were not secrets in the traditional sense, but they were hardened insights into doing more with less. Some Carethian industries adopted these methods, finding in them a resilience that buffered against Veskari manipulation. Mara watched the interplay of forces with a growing awareness that humanity's role was no longer peripheral. They were not merely guests seeking shelter. They were catalysts, altering trajectories in ways that could not be undone. This realization was both empowering and terrifying. One cycle, as she walked through a Carethian habitat ring that had been modified to accommodate human gravity preferences, she encountered Kithra again. The alien's posture was contemplative, its sensory clusters subdued. "You have introduced imbalance," Kithra said, not unkindly. Mara considered the word. "Imbalance can lead to collapse," she said, "or to adaptation." Kithra inclined its upper body. "We are adapting," it said. "Not all are comfortable with the process." Mara smiled faintly. "Neither are we," she said, "but comfort has never been our measure of success." Beyond the habitat's transparent wall, a Veskari vessel shifted position, its silhouette a reminder that patience had limits. The future pressed close, heavy with possibility and peril. Humanity had survived another turning point, not by overpowering those around them, but by refusing to be reduced to a problem to be solved. They were becoming something else entirely, a measure of unbroken hands, shaping the space between caution and courage, forcing ancient powers to reconsider what endurance truly meant. The presence of the Veskari coalition hardened from a distant pressure into a constant gravity that bent every decision within Carethian space. Their ships did not advance, but neither did they retreat. They occupied the edges of perception, always just far enough to deny immediate response, close enough to demand attention. For the Carethians, who had built their civilization on carefully managed boundaries, this was a familiar but unwelcome posture. For humans, it was a reminder of patterns learned the hard way, of enemies who preferred inevitability to open confrontation. Mara felt the strain in conversations that once had been easy. Carethian officials who had grown accustomed to human directness now weighed each word as though it might be used against them. Human technicians who had joked with their counterparts now found those interactions tinged with caution. Trust, once tentatively extended, had not been withdrawn, but it had become conditional in ways that could not be ignored. The middle path narrowed further, and walking it required constant adjustment. The Council's decision to tolerate humanity had been predicated on the assumption that their presence would be manageable, an irregularity that could be absorbed by existing systems. That assumption was eroding. Reports circulated of Carethian subpolities questioning the wisdom of continued cooperation, their leaders pressured by economic disruption and the fear of becoming targets. Others argued just as forcefully that yielding now would invite permanent subordination, that the Veskari coalition's interest would not fade simply because humanity was removed from the equation. The debate fractured along lines that had been dormant for generations. In response, the Carethians did what they had always done in times of internal uncertainty. They studied, they gathered data, ran simulations, and consulted historical precedents. What they found unsettled them. Every model that assumed human withdrawal led eventually to increased Veskari influence, not decreased. Every model that incorporated human adaptability introduced volatility, but also resilience. The numbers did not offer comfort. They offered a choice between predictable decline and unpredictable survival. Humans, meanwhile, were confronting their own divisions. Not all aboard Perseverance or its attached habitats agreed with the path Mara was steering. Some argued that humanity had already pushed its luck too far, that their role as catalysts risked painting a target too large to evade. They advocated for dispersal, for slipping away into less monitored regions before escalation became inevitable. Others argued that running again would only reinforce the pattern that had left them perpetually vulnerable, always arriving as refugees rather than partners. The arguments were heated, but grounded in shared experience. There were no illusions left to shatter. Humanity had been reduced to essentials, and what remained was a fierce debate over how best to preserve them. Mara listened, aware that her authority rested not on command but on consent. She did not dismiss fears or minimize risks. She acknowledged them, then asked a single question that cut through abstraction. "If we leave," she said, "where do we become something other than survivors?" The question lingered unanswered, not because it was rhetorical, but because it touched a wound that had not healed. Survival had been the measure for so long that imagining another metric felt dangerous. Yet the desire for more than mere endurance had not been extinguished. It smoldered, waiting for oxygen. That oxygen came in the form of an unexpected proposal from the Carethian Council. After weeks of deliberation, they extended an invitation for humanity to participate in a joint initiative aimed at strengthening regional infrastructure beyond immediate Carethian space. The project would involve repairing and upgrading relay nodes and transit corridors that had fallen into disuse, areas considered marginal and therefore neglected. Officially, it was framed as a cooperative effort to enhance stability and trade. Unofficially, it was a test. Participation would signal commitment. Failure would confirm doubts. Mara recognized the risk immediately. Sending human crews beyond the relative safety of Carethian stations would expose them to Veskari scrutiny and potential harassment. It would also stretch their limited resources thin. Yet refusing would mark humanity as unwilling to share burden, undermining the fragile trust they had built. She accepted on behalf of humanity without consulting the full assembly, a decision she knew would be contentious. She justified it later not as unilateral authority, but as acceptance of responsibility. "If we are to be part of this," she said to the assembled humans, "we cannot only show up when it is safe." The joint crews assembled in stages, Carethian engineers and security personnel paired with human specialists whose experience lay in working with outdated or compromised systems. The initial targets were modest: a relay station whose power matrix had degraded, a transit corridor cluttered with debris from an ancient collision. The work was slow and meticulous, complicated by differences in methodology and communication. Humans favored rapid assessment and iterative fixes. Carethians favored comprehensive analysis before action. Compromise was achieved through necessity rather than agreement. It was during one such operation that the first serious incident occurred. A joint crew was repairing a relay node when a Veskari patrol altered course, approaching the site under the pretense of inspection. The Carethian security detail initiated standard protocols, transmitting notices of jurisdiction and intent. The Veskari response was delayed, then dismissive, their vessels adjusting position in a way that boxed the relay node between them. The humans recognized the pattern instantly. It mirrored tactics used to isolate targets before escalation, forcing defenders into reactive postures. The Carethian commander hesitated, constrained by rules of engagement designed to prevent miscalculation. The delay was measured in seconds, but seconds were often enough. A human pilot named Sorin Dima acted without orders. He maneuvered his small craft into the narrowing space, broadcasting a continuous stream of telemetry that flooded the local channels. The data was mundane but voluminous, overwhelming the Veskari systems with irrelevant information. At the same time, human engineers rerouted power through the relay node, causing fluctuations that disrupted sensor readings without causing damage. The effect was confusion rather than confrontation. The Veskari patrol paused, their formation loosening as they recalibrated. The Carethian commander seized the moment, issuing a formal protest and ordering the patrol to withdraw from Carethian jurisdiction. This time, the Veskari complied, retreating to a distance that restored the previous standoff. The incident was logged, analyzed, and debated exhaustively. Human initiative had once again violated protocol, but it had prevented escalation. The Carethian commander submitted a report that included an addendum acknowledging the effectiveness of the human response, though he carefully avoided endorsing the method outright. Word of the incident spread quickly among both populations. For humans, it reinforced the belief that their instincts still had value beyond survival. For Carethians, it introduced a troubling realization: restraint without adaptability could be exploited. The Veskari coalition adjusted their approach. Rather than direct probes, they began to apply pressure through intermediaries, encouraging independent actors to challenge the joint projects under the guise of local disputes. Pirate bands, emboldened by promises of protection or profit, tested the edges of the upgraded corridors. Each incident required response, and each response further integrated human and Carethian operations. Mara found herself increasingly sidelined from day-to-day decisions, not because her influence waned, but because structures were forming that did not require her constant mediation. This was both a relief and a source of unease. Systems that depended on individuals were fragile. Systems that absorbed individuals' contributions and continued without them were resilient. Humanity had long suffered from over-reliance on exceptional figures. She did not want to repeat that mistake. She shifted her focus toward institutionalizing what humans brought to the table. Training programs were established, pairing Carethian cadets with human mentors in scenarios that emphasized improvisation under constraint. Humans, in turn, underwent instruction in Carethian strategic doctrine, learning the value of patience and layered response. The exchange was not symmetrical, but it was mutual. Resistance remained. Some Carethian leaders accused the Council of allowing human influence to erode cultural norms. They pointed to incidents like Soren's intervention as evidence of creeping recklessness. They warned that humanity's history of conflict would inevitably draw Carethian society into wars it had no reason to fight. These voices were not dismissed. They represented legitimate fears grounded in a desire to protect what had been built. The counter-argument, articulated by Kithra and others, was not that humans were harmless, but that stagnation was more dangerous. We have avoided conflict by making ourselves predictable, Kithra said in one council session. That strategy has reached its limit. The Veskari coalition does not seek balance. They seek inevitability. Humanity disrupts that narrative. The debate might have continued indefinitely had events not forced a decision. The crisis began at the periphery of monitored space, where a small Carethian outpost maintained a research installation studying stellar anomalies. The installation was remote, lightly defended, and of minimal strategic value. When Veskari vessels appeared without warning and issued a demand for inspection, the outpost's commander refused, citing jurisdiction. The Veskari response was swift. They disabled the installation's communication array and began boarding procedures. The Carethian distress signal, fragmented and weak, reached the nearest patrol too late for immediate intervention. It also reached a human relay crew working nearby, their equipment attuned to irregular signals. They forwarded the alert through human channels, bypassing Carethian communication hierarchies that required confirmation and authorization. Within minutes, Mara was informed. She knew the implications instantly. A Veskari boarding action, even under the guise of inspection, would establish a precedent of access that could not be easily reversed. If unchallenged, it would signal that Carethian sovereignty was negotiable under pressure. If challenged directly, it could escalate into open conflict. Mara requested an emergency audience with the council. The request was denied, not out of hostility, but because the council was already convened, grappling with incomplete information and the weight of potential war. Kithra sent a brief message instead, stripped of nuance. "We are deliberating response. Time is limited." Humans did not have the luxury of deliberation. They had learned that waiting for perfect information often meant waiting too long. Mara convened a small group of trusted advisors, both human and Carethian, and laid out a proposal that was as risky as it was audacious. "We cannot match them ship for ship," she said, "but we can change the context of the encounter. We can make boarding costly without firing a shot." The plan hinged on something humans had perfected out of necessity, making environments hostile to occupiers without destroying them. The research installation, though lightly defended, was structurally complex, its systems interdependent in ways that allowed for localized disruption. Human engineers proposed to infiltrate the installation remotely, using maintenance backdoors and legacy code that Carethian systems still carried. They would not disable life support or critical functions. Instead, they would create a cascade of minor failures that made movement and coordination difficult for the boarding party, turning every corridor into an obstacle. The Carethian advisors were uneasy. Such interference could be construed as sabotage, escalating the situation. Mara acknowledged the risk. "The alternative is acceptance," she said. "Once they are inside uncontested, we lose leverage." Authorization never came. The council continued to debate, constrained by the need for consensus and the fear of misstep. Mara made the decision anyway. Human technicians initiated the infiltration quietly, their code slipping through layers of security designed for different threat models. Lights flickered, not out but into patterns that disoriented unfamiliar eyes. Gravity fluctuated within safe parameters, but enough to disrupt coordinated movement. Access panels sealed and unsealed in unpredictable sequences. None of it caused harm. All of it consumed attention. The Veskari boarding party reported complications, requesting clarification from their command. The delay stretched. Meanwhile, Carethian patrols closed the distance, their approach no longer a question of hours but of minutes. When the patrol arrived, they found a situation transformed. The Veskari vessels were still present, but their boarding action had stalled. The Carethian commander issued a final demand for withdrawal, backed by the implicit threat of force. This time, the Veskari withdrew fully, abandoning the inspection and retreating beyond the immediate region. The aftermath was seismic. The Carethian council was furious, relieved, divided, and shaken in equal measure. Humanity had acted without authorization, manipulating Carethian infrastructure in a way that challenged fundamental assumptions about control and trust. At the same time, their actions had preserved sovereignty without bloodshed. The Veskari coalition had been checked not by superior force, but by a refusal to play along. Mara was summoned to answer for her actions. The session was unlike any before it, stripped of ceremonial distance. Accusations were made openly, support was voiced cautiously. The central question was not whether humanity had violated protocol, that was undisputed. The question was whether the violation had revealed a necessary evolution or an unacceptable risk. Mara did not defend herself, she defended the principle behind the action. "We did not act to undermine you," she said. "We acted to prevent a future where your choices narrow until compliance is the only option. We know that future, we have lived it." Kithra listened, its sensory clusters dimmed in a sign of deep contemplation. When it spoke, its words carried a weight that silenced the chamber. "You have forced us to confront a truth we have avoided," it said. That restraint alone does not guarantee peace. Sometimes it invites erosion. The council did not reach consensus that day. They did, however, reach a decision that marked a turning point. Humanity would no longer be treated solely as guests or irregular participants. A formal framework would be established to integrate human decision-making into joint operations, with defined authority and accountability. It was not full partnership. It was recognition. The Veskari coalition responded to the failed boarding with a recalibration of tone. Their communications grew colder, their offers of cooperation replaced by warnings about instability and irresponsible actors. They began repositioning assets, not for immediate assault, but for sustained pressure. Humanity, watching these developments, understood the message. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They were no longer simply surviving within someone else's space. They were shaping the strategic landscape. Mara stood once more before the blue star, its light refracted through layers of alien glass. She felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and resolve. Humanity had not found safety. They had found relevance. The two were not the same, but in a universe governed by power and perception, relevance was often the prerequisite for survival. Behind her, Carethian and human voices mingled in the corridors, planning, arguing, adapting. The future was no longer a distant abstraction. It was immediate, demanding, and unforgiving. Humanity had offered its unbroken hands not in supplication, but in defiance of inevitability. The measure of what came next would be taken not in territory or treaties, but in whether those hands could continue to shape a path between caution and courage without being forced to let go. Recognition changed the texture of everything. The formal framework that integrated human decision-making into joint Carethian operations did not arrive with ceremony or triumph. It arrived as documents, revisions, and quiet acknowledgements embedded deep within procedural language. Humans were granted defined authority in limited operational contexts, primarily those involving infrastructure resilience, emergency response, and irregular threats. The wording was careful, designed to preserve Carethian sovereignty while admitting a truth that could no longer be ignored. Humanity's methods addressed problems Carethian doctrine had not been built to face. The transition was not smooth. Authority, once shared, created friction at every seam. Carethian commanders, accustomed to clear hierarchies, bristled at the ambiguity introduced by human initiative. Human operators, long practiced in acting without permission because permission had rarely existed, struggled to adapt to a system that demanded accountability in forms they were not used to providing. Meetings grew longer. Reports multiplied. Misunderstandings were frequent and sometimes costly. Mara spent much of this period acting less as an envoy and more as a translator of intent. She explained to humans why Carethian insistence on documentation was not mistrust, but memory, a civilization-wide effort to ensure that lessons survived individuals. She explained to Carethians why humans often acted first and justified later, not out of arrogance, but because hesitation had historically been fatal. Each explanation was met with nods that did not always translate into behavior. Culture, she learned again, changed more slowly than policy. The Veskari coalition watched these developments with the patience of predators who understood time as a weapon. Their ships adjusted positions, their patrols overlapped trade routes in ways that remained technically legal while being unmistakably coercive. They began issuing advisories to neutral parties, warning that cooperation with Carethian space carried increased risk due to unregulated actors. The implication was clear. Humanity was being framed as a contagion of instability. The first tangible consequence came when a neutral merchant consortium suspended operations along a corridor recently upgraded by joint crews. The stated reason was insurance recalibration, but the subtext was fear. The corridor had become a symbol of defiance, and symbols attracted attention. The economic impact rippled outward, straining Carethian subpolities that relied on trade flows to maintain internal equilibrium. critics of human involvement seized upon the disruption as proof of their warnings. In response, humans did something that surprised even their allies. They did not argue, they did not lobby, they built alternatives. Drawing on decades of experience operating in marginal spaces, human logisticians proposed a decentralized trade network that reduced reliance on major corridors. Instead of large, predictable flows, goods would move through a web of smaller routes, each less attractive as a target and more adaptable to disruption. The model sacrificed efficiency for resilience, a trade humans had learned to make instinctively. Carethian economists were skeptical. The loss of scale ran counter to their optimization-driven philosophy. The first trials were modest, involving non-critical goods and willing partners. The results were uneven but promising. While throughput was lower, the network proved remarkably resistant to interference. When a Veskari patrol loitered near one route, traffic shifted organically to others without centralized coordination. Delays occurred, but collapse did not. Over time, some Carethian trade houses began to participate, hedging their bets against increasing pressure. This quiet success did more to shift opinion than any argument Mara could have made. It demonstrated that human unpredictability, when structured without being constrained, could create systems that bent without breaking. The phrase effective but inelegant began to acquire a different connotation, less dismissive and more appreciative. The Veskari coalition responded by escalating their narrative. They began circulating dossiers that framed humanity as inherently destabilizing, citing incidents from human history stripped of context and presented as patterns of inevitable conflict. These dossiers found receptive audiences among those who had already feared contamination by chaos. The information war intensified, subtle but pervasive. Mara recognized the danger immediately. Humans had always been judged by their worst moments, often without acknowledgement of the conditions that produced them. If that narrative took hold, no amount of practical contribution would counter it. She convened a group of human historians, sociologists, and systems thinkers, tasking them with a delicate mission: to tell humanity's story without myth-making or apology. The result was not a manifesto but an archive, a comprehensive, unvarnished record of human expansion, failure, adaptation, and survival, made available to Carethian scholars and policymakers. It did not hide humanity's violence or mistakes. It contextualized them, showing how scarcity, fear, and unequal power had shaped choices. More importantly, it highlighted patterns of learning, the slow and often painful evolution toward cooperation under constraint. Carethian scholars engaged with the archive cautiously at first, then with growing intensity. They were people who valued historical continuity, and they recognized in humanity's fractured narrative a mirror of their own distant past, when expansion had outpaced wisdom. The comparison was unsettling, but it fostered empathy that statistics could not. While this intellectual exchange unfolded, events at the edge of Carethian space accelerated. A cluster of independent habitats, nominally neutral but economically entangled with Veskari interests, declared their intention to accept Veskari security assistance. The move was framed as pragmatic, a way to ensure stability amid rising uncertainty. In practice, it would extend Veskari influence deeper into the region, creating a strategic wedge. The Carethian Council faced a dilemma. Intervening directly would violate principles of self-determination they had long upheld. Doing nothing would allow the erosion of their strategic depth. The human representatives within the new framework were consulted, their input sought not as outsiders, but as stakeholders. It was a moment that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Humans proposed an alternative that walked the narrowest of lines. Rather than opposing the habitat's decision, they suggested offering a competing form of assistance, infrastructure support, and disaster response agreements that did not involve permanent military presence. The idea was to make Veskari protection less attractive by addressing the underlying insecurities that drove the request. It was influence without occupation, presence without control. The plan required speed and trust. Joint teams were dispatched to the habitats, offering assessments and immediate aid where needed. Humans took the lead in outreach, their history of marginal survival lending credibility. They spoke not as representatives of a grand power, but as people who understood what it meant to feel abandoned by distant authorities. The reception was mixed. Some habitat leaders were wary, suspecting ulterior motives. Others, having reviewed the human archive or witnessed human intervention firsthand, were cautiously receptive. Progress was uneven, but momentum built as tangible improvements followed promises. Power grids stabilized, supply chains diversified, emergency protocols were updated to reflect real-world constraints rather than idealized models. The Veskari coalition protested, accusing the Carethians and their human partners of interference. Their protests carried less weight than they once might have. The habitats had not been coerced. They had been given options. Tensions peaked when a Veskari task force conducted a high-profile maneuver near one of the habitats that had accepted joint assistance. The message was unmistakable. Compliance had consequences. The habitat's leadership wavered, fearing retaliation they could not withstand. This time, the response was coordinated and deliberate. Carethian diplomatic channels issued formal statements reaffirming the habitat's autonomy. Human networks activated quietly, rerouting trade and resources to buffer potential disruption. The decentralized systems absorbed the shock, demonstrating resilience under pressure. The Veskari task force withdrew after days of posturing, having failed to provoke a collapse or a concession. The incident marked a shift. For the first time, Veskari influence had been blunted not by force, but by a coalition that refused to present a single point of failure. Humanity's role in that coalition was undeniable. Internally, however, the cost was mounting. Human resources were stretched thin, their people working extended rotations in unfamiliar environments. Fatigue set in, not just physical but emotional. The constant vigilance required to navigate hostile scrutiny wore on even the most resilient. Mara saw it in the way conversations shortened, in the quiet moments when laughter did not come as easily. She convened another human assembly, this one smaller and more somber. She spoke not of strategy, but of limits. "We cannot do everything," she said. "If we try, we will break. The question is not how much we can carry, but what we choose to carry together." The discussion that followed was raw and necessary. Some advocated for pulling back, consolidating gains rather than expanding commitments. Others argued that momentum was their shield, that slowing now would invite renewed pressure. The debate did not resolve cleanly. It produced instead a shared understanding that sacrifice had to be deliberate, not reflexive. Carethian leaders faced parallel reckonings. Their society had been built to minimize risk through control and predictability. Humanity had shown them the value of distributed risk and adaptive response, but adopting those principles challenged deeply held norms. Younger Carethians, who had grown up in an era of stability, were more receptive. Older generations, shaped by the memory of near collapse, were more cautious. The generational divide widened. Kithra found itself at the center of this tension, a bridge figure whose willingness to engage with human perspectives had elevated its influence and attracted scrutiny. In private conversation with Mara, Kithra expressed uncertainty that would have been unthinkable earlier. "We are changing faster than we have in centuries," it said. "Change carries risk, so does remaining as we are. I do not know which danger is greater." Mara considered the admission carefully. "Neither do we," she said, "but we know what happens when we stop changing. We disappear." The turning point came not from grand strategy, but from failure. A joint operation aimed at stabilizing a remote transit hub encountered unexpected resistance from a local faction that had been quietly aligned with Veskari interests. The factions sabotaged critical systems, triggering a cascade that overwhelmed response teams. Human and Carethian personnel were trapped for hours, fighting to prevent total collapse. When the hub was finally secured, the damage was extensive and lives had been lost. The aftermath was brutal. Critics seized on the incident as proof that joint operations invited chaos. Accusations flew, some directed at humanity's aggressive timelines, others at Carethian hesitance that delayed decisive action. Grief sharpened every edge. For a moment, it seemed as though the fragile coalition might fracture under the weight of blame. Mara addressed both communities in a broadcast that eschewed reassurance. She spoke of responsibility, of the cost of action and inaction alike. She named the failure without deflection, acknowledging where human urgency had overridden local context, where Carethian caution had slowed response. She did not promise that such losses would not happen again. She promised that they would not be ignored or minimized. The honesty was unsettling. It was also grounding. Investigations followed, not as witch hunts, but as efforts to understand systemic weaknesses. Procedures were revised, authority lines clarified, training expanded to include cultural and situational awareness, not just technical skill. The loss became a lesson rather than a rupture. The Veskari coalition, observing this response, adjusted their calculations again. They had expected fragmentation, a retreat into mutual suspicion. Instead, they saw a coalition absorb a blow and reconfigure without disintegrating. It was not the behavior of a fragile alliance. It was the behavior of a system learning under pressure. Their next move was more direct. A formal ultimatum was delivered to the Carethian Council, framed in language of concern and responsibility. The Veskari coalition demanded that humanity be removed from all joint operational roles within Carethian space, citing instability and unauthorized actions. In exchange, they offered guarantees of non-interference and favorable trade terms. The offer was calculated to appeal to those who valued certainty over autonomy. The council was split more deeply than ever. The ultimatum forced a choice that could no longer be deferred. Accepting would restore a measure of predictability at the cost of independence and the trust built with humanity. Rejecting would escalate tensions toward open confrontation, a prospect many feared. Human representatives were present but did not speak initially. Mara waited, understanding that this decision could not be made for them. When she did speak, it was not to persuade but to clarify. "We will not ask you to fight for us," she said. "We will not ask you to endanger yourselves for our sake. If you choose to accept this offer, we will comply. We will withdraw from joint roles and find our own path. But understand this, the pressure you feel now will not vanish. It will return, reshaped, until there is nothing left to yield." The words hung in the chamber, heavy and unadorned. They were not a threat. They were an observation born of experience. Kithra rose to address the council. Its voice carried the weight of a civilization at a crossroads. "We have been offered safety before," it said. "It was always conditional, always temporary. We survived by believing that predictability was protection. Humanity has shown us another truth, that adaptability is also a form of defense. To reject that now would be to deny what we have learned." The vote that followed was not unanimous, it was decisive. The Carethian Council rejected the ultimatum. The response from the Veskari coalition was swift but restrained. Trade pressures intensified. Patrols grew more assertive. Diplomatic channels cooled. War did not come immediately. Instead, the region entered a state of heightened tension that demanded constant vigilance. Humanity, having crossed the threshold from tolerated irregularity to acknowledged partner, felt the full weight of that choice. There would be no return to obscurity. The path ahead promised neither peace nor rest. It promised only the opportunity to continue shaping events rather than being shaped by them. Mara stood once more at the observation gallery, the blue star unchanged in its indifferent brilliance. Around her, Carethian and human systems intertwined, imperfect and evolving. The measure of unbroken hands was not found in triumph or dominance, but in the willingness to grasp uncertainty and refuse to let go. The future was no longer a refuge to be sought. It was a responsibility to be borne together in the narrowing space between fear and resolve. Rejection of the ultimatum did not bring immediate catastrophe. That absence of instant consequence unsettled everyone more than an attack would have. The Veskari coalition understood escalation as a gradient, not a switch, and they now applied pressure with an almost pedagogical precision. Every response was calibrated to test resolve, to expose fractures, to measure how much strain the coalition of Carethians and humans could bear before reverting to safer patterns. The first phase was isolation. Veskari influence spread through diplomatic channels, quietly encouraging neutral powers to distance themselves from Carethian space. Joint ventures were labeled high risk. Insurance rates spiked. Information exchanges slowed as data custodians introduced additional layers of review. None of it violated interstellar law. All of it narrowed options. Carethian society felt the constriction acutely. Their economy, optimized for stability and scale, was not designed for fragmentation. Long-standing assumptions about uninterrupted trade and predictable growth faltered. Human systems absorbed disruption more easily, but humans were the minority partner, their capacity finite. The coalition began to feel like a structure bearing weight, unevenly distributed. Mara worked longer hours than she ever had aboard Perseverance. The work was no longer about mediation alone, but about triage, which projects could be paused without collapse, which commitments were essential to maintain credibility, which promises could be renegotiated without undermining trust. Every decision carried second and third-order consequences, and there was no simulation comprehensive enough to model them all. Fatigue became a strategic concern. Human crews rotated back to habitats more frequently, not because the work was finished, but because mistakes born of exhaustion were becoming more likely. Carethian counterparts struggled with this approach, viewing withdrawal as inefficiency. Humans framed it as sustainability. The tension highlighted a deeper philosophical divide, whether endurance was best achieved through continuous exertion or deliberate pacing. The Veskari coalition escalated again, this time through narrative rather than logistics. A series of public statements framed the situation as a humanitarian concern, portraying humanity as a destabilized population dragging Carethian society toward unnecessary conflict. They offered to absorb human populations into Veskari-administered regions, promising security, resources, and an end to uncertainty. The offer was deliberately framed as benevolent, echoing language humans recognized all too well. The reaction among humans was visceral. Anger flared not just at the offer itself, but at the assumption behind it, that humanity's role was to be managed, relocated, resolved. Mara received messages from across the habitats, some urging her to denounce the Veskari publicly, others warning that such rhetoric could provoke retaliation. She chose a third path. Humanity declined the offer collectively, but without spectacle. A statement was issued through Carethian channels, co-signed by human representatives and Carethian council members. It thanked the Veskari coalition for their concern, reaffirmed humanity's autonomy, and stated plainly that decisions about human futures would be made by humans themselves. There was no accusation, no moral grandstanding, just refusal. The simplicity of it was disarming. It denied the Veskari coalition the narrative conflict they sought. It also forced Carethian society to confront a reality that could no longer be abstracted. Humanity was not a temporary problem awaiting resolution. They were an enduring presence making choices. Pressure shifted again, this time inward. Carethian subpolities that had opposed the rejection of the ultimatum intensified their objections. Economic councils warned of long-term decline. Cultural preservation groups argued that human influence was eroding foundational norms. Security analysts warned that adaptability without restraint could spiral into chaos. The debates were no longer theoretical. They were personal, touching livelihoods, identities, and fears shaped by centuries of stability. Kithra found itself increasingly isolated, respected, but scrutinized. Its advocacy for integration had made it a symbol, and symbols attract opposition. In private, it confided to Mara that it no longer slept as it once had, its rest cycles disrupted by constant recalibration. Leadership under uncertainty, it said, is not a role we have practiced often. Neither have we, Mara replied. We just have more scars from learning it badly. The next escalation was the most dangerous yet, precisely because it did not look like one. A coordinated systems anomaly began affecting joint infrastructure projects. Power fluctuations, data corruption, minor navigational errors. Each incident alone was manageable. Together, they created a pattern of friction that slowed operations and eroded confidence. Investigations suggested external interference, but attribution was elusive. The disruptions were subtle, exploiting the very interdependence the coalition had built. Humans recognized the tactic immediately. It mirrored strategies used to exhaust resistance without triggering overt conflict. Carethian analysts confirmed the assessment, but struggled with response options. Retaliation required certainty. Certainty was being deliberately denied. Mara convened a crisis working group that included human systems specialists and Carethian theorists. The discussions were intense, technical, and often frustrating. Humans pushed for rapid countermeasures, arguing that waiting for proof would allow the damage to accumulate. Carethians cautioned against acting on suspicion, fearing that misattribution could escalate the situation uncontrollably. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A junior Carethian analyst who had been studying the human historical archive. She observed that many human responses to similar tactics had focused not on stopping interference, but on rendering it ineffective by changing underlying assumptions. Instead of trying to identify and block every intrusion, humans often redesigned systems to function despite them. The idea resonated. Rather than chasing the source of the disruptions, the coalition began reconfiguring infrastructure to tolerate persistent low-level interference. Redundancies were diversified. Control systems were decentralized further. Human-designed modularity was layered onto Carethian precision. Efficiency dropped. Resilience increased. The interference did not stop. It simply mattered less. This adaptation marked a psychological turning point. For the first time, Carethian planners accepted ongoing pressure as a baseline condition rather than an aberration to be corrected. Humanity's long familiarity with adversity became an asset rather than a liability. The coalition stopped waiting for normal to return and began defining a new one. The Veskari coalition responded with frustration thinly veiled as concern. Their communications grew sharper, their patience visibly wearing. The slow grind was not producing capitulation. Instead, it was producing adaptation. Then came the incident that stripped away all pretense. A human-operated logistics vessel traveling along a decentralized route was intercepted by a Veskari patrol well outside contested zones. The patrol claimed a navigational discrepancy justified inspection. The vessel complied, transmitting logs and opening non-critical sections. During the inspection, a Veskari officer ordered access to human data cores, citing regional security protocols that did not apply. The human crew refused. The standoff lasted minutes. Then the Veskari patrol disabled the vessel's propulsion, leaving it adrift. They did not board. They did not fire. They transmitted a notice that the vessel would remain detained pending further review. The message was clear. Compliance was expected. Autonomy was conditional. News of the detention spread rapidly. human habitats erupted in anger and fear. Carethian councils convened in emergency session. The incident crossed a line that could not be smoothed over with language. It was coercion, plain and undeniable. Mara felt a cold clarity settle over her. This was the moment every previous escalation had been moving toward. Not war, but domination by precedent. If the coalition allowed this detention to stand, the framework they had built would unravel. Every decentralized route, every adaptive system would exist at Veskari sufferance. The Carethian Council debated immediate response. Options ranged from diplomatic protest to armed escort. Each carried risk. Direct military action could spiral. Inaction would signal weakness. Mara requested the floor. What they want, she said, is for us to argue about how much we are willing to lose. They expect us to measure risk the way they do. We should not. She proposed a response rooted not in force, but in collective refusal. The coalition would not attempt to negotiate the release of the vessel. Instead, they would suspend all cooperation with Veskari traffic across Carethian space, invoking every legal mechanism available. Trade corridors would close, data exchanges would halt, joint scientific initiatives would be frozen. The message would be simple: detention of a civilian vessel nullified assumptions of good faith. Some council members recoiled at the scale of the response. The economic cost would be severe, the risk of retaliation high. Mara did not soften the reality. This will hurt, she said, but if we accept this, we teach them exactly how much pressure it takes to make us comply, and they will use that knowledge again. The debate raged for hours. When the decision came, it was narrower than any before it. But it passed. The coalition enacted the suspension. The effect was immediate and far-reaching. Veskari trade routes through Carethian space ground to a halt. Data lags cascaded through systems accustomed to seamless exchange. Diplomatic protests flooded in. The Veskari coalition demanded reversal, accusing the Carethians and their human partners of reckless escalation. The coalition held. Meanwhile, the detained human vessel remained adrift, its crew safe but immobilized. Human support networks activated, routing supplies through indirect means. Carethian patrols maintained a visible presence nearby, careful not to cross engagement thresholds, but making it clear that further interference would be observed closely. Days passed. Tension mounted. The Veskari coalition faced a choice of their own: escalate militarily, revealing the coercion behind their posture, or release the vessel and seek to reframe the situation. They released the vessel. The patrol transmitted a terse message citing procedural misinterpretation and restored propulsion. No apology was offered. None was expected. The coalition reopened limited channels shortly afterward, framing the incident as resolved. The suspension eased gradually, not fully lifted, but adjusted to allow essential flows. The message was implicit. The line had been tested and found firmer than anticipated. The cost was real. Economic losses were significant. Some neutral parties distanced themselves further, unwilling to navigate heightened tensions. Internal critics argued that the response had been disproportionate, that it risked provoking future incidents. They were not entirely wrong, but something else had changed. Humanity was no longer being discussed as a destabilizing influence to be managed. They were being discussed as a factor that altered outcomes. The Veskari coalition adjusted their strategies accordingly, treating the coalition not as a pliable region, but as an adaptive system capable of coordinated resistance. For humans, the incident carried deep emotional weight. It was the first time since their flight from earlier losses that a larger power had been forced to back down without bloodshed. It did not erase trauma or guarantee safety. It did something quieter and more profound. It restored a sense of agency. Mara visited the returned vessel personally, speaking with the crew not as an official, but as someone who understood the cost of being made an example. She did not offer platitudes. She listened. She thanked them for holding the line without knowing whether support would come. That night, she stood again at the observation gallery. The blue star burned steadily, indifferent as ever. Around her, the coalition continued its uneasy work, neither at peace nor at war, but something more complex and fragile. The measure of unbroken hands was not found in victory banners or territorial gains. It was found in moments like this, when pressure revealed whether a grip would loosen or tighten. Humanity had tightened theirs, not alone, but alongside those willing to accept the discomfort of shared resolve. The future remained uncertain. The Veskari coalition was not defeated. The path ahead promised further tests, subtler and more severe, but the precedent had been set. Coercion had limits, adaptation had power, and humanity, once reduced to survivors drifting between hostile stars, had become something else entirely, a presence that changed the shape of decisions, not by demanding obedience, but by refusing to let go. The release of the detained vessel did not bring relief so much as clarity. The coalition of Carethians and humans now occupied a space that could no longer be misunderstood by any power watching from beyond the blue star's light. They were not rebels, not insurgents, not a bloc seeking conquest. They were a system that had demonstrated an ability to absorb pressure, respond collectively, and impose cost without resorting to annihilation. That combination unsettled every strategic model built on the assumption that resistance always escalated toward war or collapsed into submission. The Veskari coalition recalibrated accordingly. Their ships maintained distance, their communications adopted a colder formality, and their indirect pressure resumed in quieter ways. Influence campaigns shifted toward long timelines, seeding doubt rather than demanding compliance. The absence of overt confrontation did not signal peace. It signaled a contest that would be measured in years rather than battles. Within Carethian space, the effects of the standoff continued to ripple. Economic systems adjusted unevenly, some sectors shrinking while others adapted. Trade houses that had relied on scale learned to operate within the coalition's decentralized networks, grumbling at inefficiency while quietly acknowledging durability. Younger Carethians, who had grown up assuming stability as a given, began to internalize a different lesson, that endurance was not the absence of disruption, but the capacity to function through it. Humans, for their part, faced a reckoning of identity. Survival alone was no longer sufficient to explain who they were becoming. They were no longer merely refugees or catalysts. They were participants in a shared future whose shape they helped define. That realization carried responsibility as heavy as any threat they had faced. Mara felt that weight keenly. Her role had evolved beyond envoy, beyond coordinator. She had become a symbol whether she wished it or not, a focal point for hopes and fears that extended far beyond her individual capacity. She worked to dismantle that concentration of attention, delegating authority, elevating voices that had earned trust through action rather than proximity to power. She remembered too well how human history had suffered from reliance on singular figures, how collapse often followed when those figures faltered. The framework governing human participation in coalition decision-making matured through necessity. What had begun as ad hoc authority became codified roles, with checks designed jointly by human and Carethian legal theorists. The language was careful, acknowledging differences in cultural assumptions about responsibility and consent. It was imperfect, but it was shared, and that mattered more than elegance. One of the most significant developments emerged not from strategic councils, but from education. Joint academies were established on several stations, bringing together Carethian and human students in disciplines that blended theory and improvisation. Crisis modeling included scenarios with incomplete information and conflicting priorities. Ethics courses examined not just rules, but consequences under constraint. The aim was not to produce uniformity, but fluency in difference. These academies became crucibles of tension and insight. Carethian students struggled with exercises that rewarded deviation from protocol. Human students struggled with the patience required to justify actions beyond immediate outcomes. Arguments were frequent, so were breakthroughs. Over time, a shared professional culture began to emerge, one that valued adaptability without glorifying recklessness, caution without paralysis. The Vescari coalition monitored these developments with unease. They were accustomed to societies fracturing under sustained pressure, not cohering. Their analysts noted with concern that the coalition's responses were becoming faster and more coordinated despite reduced centralization. Influence operations met diminishing returns. Attempts to isolate individual actors failed as networks compensated organically. In response, the Vescari coalition attempted a final, decisive reframing. They convened a multilateral summit, inviting neutral powers and extending an invitation to the Carethians. The stated purpose was regional stability and conflict prevention. Humanity was not invited. The omission was deliberate, signaling that the Vescari coalition still viewed humans as an anomaly to be excluded rather than a legitimate stakeholder. The Carethian Council debated the invitation intensely. Attending without humanity would imply acceptance of that framing. Declining would be seen as obstinacy, potentially alienating neutrals. The decision cut to the core of everything that had changed. Mara did not lobby, she made no speech. She trusted that the work done over months of shared strain had altered how the Carethians understood themselves. When the council announced its decision, the message was brief and unambiguous. They would attend the summit. Humanity would attend as part of their delegation. The Vescari coalition protested immediately, citing procedural norms and established precedents. The Carethians responded with equal calm, stating that their delegation reflected their internal governance and partnerships. The summit organizers faced a choice: accept the reality of a changed region or expose the limits of their authority by rescinding the invitation entirely. They accepted. The summit was held in neutral space, a vast orbital complex designed to project impartiality through symmetry and scale. Mara arrived alongside Carethian representatives, acutely aware of every gaze that followed her and the humans with her. They did not dress for intimidation. They dressed, as they always had, in practical attire marked by the subtle wear of use. The opening sessions unfolded with ritualized caution. Statements emphasized cooperation, stability, and mutual respect. The Vescari coalition spoke at length about the dangers of unmanaged variables and the need for responsible stewardship of emerging actors. The implication hung heavy in the air. When it was the coalition's turn to speak, Kithra addressed the assembly. Its voice carried not defiance, but confidence shaped by experience. It spoke of adaptation, of lessons learned through engagement rather than exclusion. It framed humanity not as a destabilizing force, but as a mirror that had revealed vulnerabilities long ignored. Mara was given the floor last. She did not recount grievances or enumerate contributions. She spoke instead of patterns. Every civilization represented here, she said, has faced a moment when its assumptions stopped working. Some responded by tightening control, others by withdrawing, others by breaking apart. Humanity has been through that moment repeatedly, not because we are exceptional, but because we are fragile. We learn to survive by building systems that do not depend on perfection. She paused, letting the words settle. We are not here to ask for permission to exist. We are here because we already do. The question is not whether change can be prevented. It is whether it can be shaped. The response was mixed, as expected. Some delegates were intrigued, others dismissive. The Vescari coalition countered with warnings about instability and the risks of legitimizing irregular actors. The debate stretched over cycles, marked by careful language and strategic silences. No grand agreement emerged from the summit. That too was expected. What did emerge was something subtler and more enduring. Humanity's presence was normalized, not embraced by all, but acknowledged. They were no longer an omission that could be corrected by convenience. They were a factor that had to be accounted for. In the months that followed, the region settled into a tense equilibrium. The Veskari coalition adjusted their strategies, focusing on influence where they could still exert it, avoiding actions that might unify opposition further. The coalition continued its work, expanding resilient infrastructure, refining governance, and absorbing new participants cautiously. There were setbacks. Not every habitat chose partnership over protection. Not every crisis was managed cleanly. Loss still occurred, though less catastrophically than before. Humanity did not become invulnerable, neither did the Carethians. What they became was something rarer, difficult to coerce. Mara stepped back gradually, transferring formal responsibilities to a council that reflected the diversity of the coalition. She remained involved, but no longer central. The transition was not seamless. She made mistakes, corrected them, accepted correction in turn. Letting go of indispensability was one of the hardest lessons she had ever learned. On the anniversary of Perseverance's arrival, a small gathering was held in one of the early shared habitats. There were no speeches, no banners. Humans and Carethians shared food, adapted through mutual compromise, exchanged stories of failures that had taught more than successes. Children born since that first docking played together in gravity fields calibrated somewhere between worlds, their movements unself-conscious and unafraid. Mara watched them and felt a quiet, unfamiliar emotion settle in her chest. Not triumph, not relief, something closer to continuity. Later, she returned alone to the observation gallery. The blue star burned as it always had, vast and indifferent. Around it, the structures of two civilizations interwove, not seamlessly, but deliberately. She thought of the convoy that had not survived, of the losses that had brought humanity here with nothing but endurance and the refusal to disappear. They had not found safety in the absolute sense. The universe did not offer that. What they had found was space to act, to matter, to shape outcomes rather than be crushed by them. They had offered their unbroken hands not as weapons or pleas, but as instruments of work, of connection, of shared burden. The measure of those hands was not in strength alone, but in persistence. In the willingness to grasp uncertainty, to endure strain without closing into fists, to hold fast alongside others who chose the same discomfort. The future stretched outward, uncharted and uncompromising. There would be new pressures, new powers, new mistakes. Humanity would face them as they always had, not as a singular force imposing its will, but as a presence that altered equations simply by refusing to be simplified. Mara rested her hands against the cool surface of the viewing pane, feeling the faint vibration of life and effort moving through the station behind her. She did not know how history would remember this moment or whether it would be remembered at all. She knew only this: humanity was no longer running. They were standing alongside others who had chosen to stand with them. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough.